Hi, this is James from Canonical. Today we are talking about Abdulrazak Gurnah's Paradise.
So, uh, this book has a bit of history of confusing some Western critics. There are a number who have compared it to Conrad's Heart of Darkness, such as Johann Jacobs. Johann Jacobs? I feel like I should know that. I'm going to say
Johann
I'm
Jacobs.
going to say Johann Jacobs.
John Jake.
hmm Who went so far as to say that Gurnah is kind of following in the footsteps of Conrad, that Gurnah is portraying a kind of backward new version of that earlier journey. But while I think that's possible, it also feels very simplistic. It's a journey into the Congo, but I don't think there are that many similarities beyond that. Other critics like James Hodapp have pointed out how Eurocentric that is, and I won't reiterate all his points except to say that he says there is plenty of evidence of the non European influence in Paradise. I looked up the Yusuf chapter of the Quran, and honestly, it seemed kind of dumb that Conrad would be the first thing someone would point to, considering how many parallels there are to the other Yusuf, as some of the characters call him. In fact, much of this story mirrors the accounts of Joseph or Yusuf, a figure or prophet of um, the book of Genesis and the Quran, respectively. So my question is, why might Gurnah do that? Is this a retelling? It's obviously not the first time that has been done in a novel. But when we compare this with other novels we've read with religious subtext or allegory, I think it's easier to see the reason for that use of religion behind those. So I'm thinking of, for example, a children's Bible or Parable of the Sower or Signs Preceding the End of the World. So what does he gain by rooting his character in this older account?
So I didn't know much about the tale of Yusuf, the Quran version of the story, before reading this book. So it seems, after reading about what that story is, it seems like it is very clearly a retelling.
The parallels are very strong. It's if you know where to look, it's kind of obvious.
Right? He's always described as what, handsome in the book, and Yusuf is supposedly a very handsome man. There is that story in the Quran about him being accused of some impropriety with the wife, right? And then there's
Mhm.
that story about his shirt being torn from the back. I mean, you can't get more explicit than that, I think.
Right. There are other parallels, but yeah, that that seems pretty exact. So, I mean, is this just a retelling? Is that, do you think, the whole purpose behind that?
I would say no, because, well, he does belong to a non African tradition. Yusuf, the character in the story, is African. So it is a merger of this kind of foreign literary or religious character with an indigenous African. And that to me, I think, is substantial coming from somebody who is very similar to that in his own personal, identity. Gurna is African, but he is of Arab descent.
Does using such a framework help translate any ideas beyond those, beyond that similarity, more effectively for a particular audience? Is it is it just what you said, that this is kind of translating that story for an African audience, or does it help him do some other legwork?
I mean, it's very tough to say because I don't know if this is something that's meant for me as a Western reader. Although I can't really say that Gurna had a Tanzanian reader in mind, it seems like he's calling on two separate traditions that don't include us.
Yeah, I agree because I'm not conversant in the Quran, and all I know about this story is what I've read online, over the span of what, half an hour or something. So, um, the difficulty is how can we ascribe any significance to this if, as Iad said, we are not perhaps the target audience?
I guess what I'm curious about is with those other books I mentioned, with a children's Bible, Parable of the Sower, Signs Preceding the End of the World, it wasn't just retellings. It they were more than that. There was allegory, or there was, um, it felt like there was more going on, and I think there is more going on with this book. It feels like we should be able to suss out some kind of meaning, not from the use of this other story, but like why go to this length to give these exact parallels but hide it in the ways that it's hidden? Like, it is clear, but it's not like he's writing from a different universe.
I think what I could say to that is that it's clear from the broadest perspective that Yusuf in Islam is a revered person, somebody with a lot of very positive features, but also somebody endowed with the gift of prophecy. He could see things that normal people could not. In the context of the novel, it could be said that Yusuf is the opposite of a prophet because he seems very unaware of things. He doesn't understand his situation in the world. But perhaps at the end of the novel, with the arrival of the soldiers, he has his first prophecy. That's one way of thinking about it. Again, it's, I think, calling on to traditions that don't necessarily belong to us, but I think that there are parallels that can be drawn that I don't even know who the right person would be to draw those parallels. I can only say it's not me. I think there is another aspect too, though. I want to take you to task a little bit, Sam. You had criticized, or you had some harsh words for Mr. Jacobs for comparing this novel to Heart of Darkness, but I don't think that's entirely fair.
I don't think it's entirely fair in that Heart of Darkness is, you know, to use the a familiar word, uh, canonized in literature, especially Western literature. And so it's hard to escape certain figures like Conrad, especially this kind of iconic journey into the center of, the heart of darkness.
Oh,
But
that's what it means.
now you get it. Um, and they're going into the same place, and I can see the argument that Gurnah is kind of doing the reverse because it's the opposite direction. Um, they're moving in from the east side, whereas Conrad's characters are coming from the west side. But that seems like such a simplified way of looking at it. And Hodap had some pretty good uh, points for taking Jacobs to task as well. Um,
Well, let me ask you this. When Jacobs makes this Conrad interpretation, it doesn't mean that he didn't see the Yusuf interpretation. It just means that he's not talking about it, right?
maybe, but
The way I see it, it's not an interpretive problem, it's a disciplinary problem. Now, I don't know Jacobs, but if he is a scholar of English literature rather than a scholar of Arabic literature or a scholar of Islam, wouldn't it make more sense that the things that he writes about professionally have to do with English literature?
yes, but to assume that all Eastern, and this is a slight leap, but is to assume that all writers of Eastern descent are writing from a Western standpoint, or that all Eastern writing has to echo back to some Western tradition is a bit of an overstep, I think.
I don't think he is saying that. I think what you're pushing for is kind of a definitive interpretation where this is the interpretation and it must be true. I don't know if that's what's really going on. I think that, especially with post-colonial writing, they draw on identities that are very mixed. And for you to say you have to get the correct interpretation out of it would require the critic to have the same mixture of identities, right? And that's just very difficult. Now, Gurnah's identity as Tanzanian, and now he's lived in Britain for like 50 years. That's pretty common, I would suppose. But what about somebody who was like a mixture of Thai and Tanzanian, and he used both influences in his writing? Nobody could interpret that kind of work.
I don't have Jacobs in front of me, or Hodap for that matter, but I remember that Hodap was pretty clear in laying out Jacobs's claims and saying this is unfair, this is false. And maybe Hodap was wrong too. Maybe he also, as you put it, was putting too much on Jacobs that wasn't there.
Well, let me ask you in a different way. You know, there is English literature as a field of study. There's also comparative literature. Why does comparative literature exist, and does it need to continue existing?
Yeah, I guess that's a good way of putting it. Sure. I guess that is a separate field, and it probably should remain that way. I always thought there was some blending there. I think in college I didn't quite get the difference between comparative literature and literature in general,